Chapter 18 of The Jewel of Seven Stars. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker. Chapter 18. The Lesson of the Ka. That night we all went to bed early. The next night would be an anxious one, and Mr. Trelawney thought that we should all be fortified with what sleep we could get. The day, too, would be full of work. Everything in connection with the great experiment would have to be gone over, so that at the last we might not fail from any unthought-of flaw in our working. We made, of course, arrangements for summoning aid in case such should be needed, but I do not think that any of us had any real apprehension of danger. Certainly we had no fear of such danger from violence as we had had to guard against in London during Mr. Trelawney's long trance. For my own part, I felt a strange sense of relief in the matter. I had accepted Mr. Trelawney's reasoning that if the Queen were indeed such as we surmised, such as indeed we now took for granted, there would not be any opposition on her part, for we were carrying out her own wishes to the very last. So far I was at ease, far more at ease than earlier in the day I should have thought possible, but there were other sources of trouble which I could not blot out from my mind. Chief amongst them was Margaret's strange condition. If it was indeed that she had in her own person a dual existence, what might happen when the two existences became one? Again and again and again I turned this matter over in my mind till I could have shrieked out in nervous anxiety. It was no consolation to me to remember that Margaret was herself satisfied and her father acquiescent. Love is, after all, a selfish thing, and it throws a black shadow on anything between which and the light it stands. I seemed to hear the hands go round the dial of the clock. I saw darkness turn to gloom, and gloom to gray, and gray to light without pause or hindrance to the succession of my miserable feelings. At last, when it was decently possible without the fear of disturbing others, I got up. I crept along the passage to find if all was well with the others, for we had arranged that the door of each of our rooms should be left slightly open so that any sound of disturbance would be easily and distinctly heard. One and all slept. I could hear the regular breathing of each, and my heart rejoiced that this miserable night of anxiety was safely passed. As I knelt in my own room in a burst of thankful prayer, I knew in the depths of my own heart the measure of my fear. I found my way out of the house and went down to the water by the long stairway cut in the rock. A swim in the cool, bright sea braced my nerves and made me my old self again. As I came back to the top of the steps, I could see the bright sunlight rising from behind me, turning the rocks across the bay to glittering gold. And yet I felt somehow disturbed. It was all too bright, as it sometimes is before the coming of a storm. As I paused to watch it, I felt a soft hand on my shoulder, and turning, found Margaret close to me. Margaret as bright and radiant as the morning glory of the sun. It was my own Margaret this time. My old Margaret, without alloy of any other. And I felt that, at least, this last and fatal day was well begun. But, alas! The joy did not last. When we got back to the house from a stroll around the cliffs, the same old routine of yesterday was resumed. Gloom and anxiety, hope, high spirits, deep depression, and apathetic aloofness. But it was to be a day of work, and we all braced ourselves to it with an energy which wrought its own salvation. After breakfast we all adjourned to the cave, where Mr. Trelawney went over, point by point, the position of each item of our paraphernalia. He explained as he went on why each piece was so placed. He had with him the great rolls of paper with the measured plans and the signs and drawings which he had had made from his own and Corbeck's rough notes. As he had told us, these contained the whole of the hieroglyphics on walls and ceilings and floor of the tomb in the Valley of the Sorcerer. Even had not the measurements, made to scale, recorded the position of each piece of furniture, we could have eventually placed them by a study of the cryptic writings and symbols. Mr. Trelawney explained to us certain other things, not laid down on the chart. Such as, for instance, that the hollowed part of the table was exactly fitted to the bottom of the magic coffer, which was therefore intended to be placed on it. The respective legs of this table were indicated by differently shaped uraei outlined on the floor, the head of each being extended in the direction of the similar uraeus twined around the leg. Also that the mummy, when laid on the raised portion in the bottom of the sarcophagus, seemingly made to fit the form, would lie head to the west and feet to the east, thus receiving the natural earth currents. "If this be intended," he said, "as I presume it is, I gather that the force to be used has something to do with magnetism, or electricity, or both. It may be, of course, that some other force, such for instance as that emanating from radium, is to be employed. I have experimented with the latter, but only in such small quantity as I could obtain. But so far as I can ascertain, the stone of the coffer is absolutely impervious to its influence. There must be some such unsusceptible substances in nature. Radium does not seemingly manifest itself when distributed through pitchblende, and there are doubtless other such substances in which it can be imprisoned. Possibly these may belong to that class of inert elements discovered or isolated by Sir William Ramsay. It is therefore possible that in this coffer, made from an aerolite and therefore perhaps containing some element unknown in our world, may be imprisoned some mighty power which is to be released on its opening." This appeared to be an end of this branch of the subject, but as he still kept the fixed look of one who is engaged in a theme, we all waited in silence. After a pause, he went on: "There is one thing which has up to now, I confess, puzzled me. It may not be of prime importance, but in a matter like this, where all is unknown, we must take it that everything is important. I cannot think that in a matter worked out with such extraordinary scrupulosity such a thing should be overlooked. As you may see by the ground plan of the tomb, the sarcophagus stands near the north wall, with the magic coffer to the south of it. The space covered by the former is left quite bare of symbol or ornamentation of any kind. At the first glance this would seem to imply that the drawings had been made after the sarcophagus had been put into its place. But a more minute examination will show that the symbolization on the floor is so arranged that a definite effect is produced. See, here the writings run in correct order as though they had jumped across the gap. It is only from certain effects that it becomes clear that there is a meaning of some kind. What that meaning may be is what we want to know. Look at the top and bottom of the vacant space, which lies west and east corresponding to the head and foot of the sarcophagus. In both are duplications of the same symbolization, but so arranged that the parts of each one of them are integral portions of some other writing running crosswise. It is only when we get a coup d'œil from either the head or the foot that you recognize that there are symbolizations. See, they are in triplicate at the corners and the center of both top and bottom. In every case there is a sun cut in half by the line of the sarcophagus, as by the horizon. Close behind each of these, and faced away from it, as though in some way dependent on it, is the vase which in hieroglyphic writing symbolizes the heart. Ab, the Egyptians called it. Beyond each of these again is the figure of a pair of widespread arms turned upwards from the elbow. This is the determinative of the Ka, or double. But its relative position is different at top and bottom. At the head of the sarcophagus, the top of the ka is turned towards the mouth of the vase, but at the foot the extended arms point away from it. The symbolization seems to mean that during the passing of the sun from west to east, from sunset to sunrise, or through the underworld, otherwise night, the heart, which is material even in the tomb and cannot leave it, simply revolves so that it can always rest on Ra, the sun god, the origin of all good. But that the double, which represents the active principle, goes whither it will, the same by night as by day. If this be correct, it is a warning, a caution, a reminder that the consciousness of the mummy does not rest but is to be reckoned with. Or it may be intended to convey that after the particular night of the resurrection, the ka would leave the heart altogether, thus typifying that in her resurrection the queen would be restored to a lower and purely physical existence. In such case, what would become of her memory and the experiences of her wide-wandering soul? The chiefest value of her resurrection would be lost to the world. This, however, does not alarm me. It is only guesswork, after all, and is contradictory to the intellectual belief of the Egyptian theology that the ka is an essential portion of humanity. He paused, and we all waited. The silence was broken by Dr. Winchester. But would not all this imply that the Queen feared intrusion of her tomb? Mr. Trelawney smiled as he answered, "My dear sir, she was prepared for it. The grave robber is no modern application of endeavor. He was probably known in the Queen's own dynasty. Not only was she prepared for intrusion, but, as shown in several ways, she expected it. The hiding of the lamps in the serdab, and the institution of the avenging treasurer, shows that there was defense, positive as well as negative. Indeed, from the many indications afforded in the clues laid out with the most consummated thought, we may almost gather that she entertained it as a possibility that others, like ourselves for instance, might in all seriousness undertake the work which she had made ready for her own hands when the time should have come. This very matter that I have been speaking of is an instance. The clue is intended for seeing eyes." Again we were silent. It was Margaret who spoke. "Father, may I have that chart? I should like to study it during the day." "Certainly, my dear," answered Mr. Trelawney heartily as he handed it to her. He resumed his instructions in a different tone, a more matter-of-fact one, suitable to a practical theme which had no mystery about it. "I think you had better all understand the working of the electric light in case any sudden contingency should arise. I dare say you have noticed that we have a complete supply in every part of the house, so that there need not be a dark corner anywhere. This I had specially arranged. It is worked by a set of turbines moved by the flowing and ebbing tide, after the manner of the turbines at Niagara. I hope by this means to nullify accident and to have without fail a full supply ready at any time. Come with me and I will explain the system of circuits and point out to you the taps and the fuses." I could not but notice, as we went with him all over the house, how absolutely complete the system was, and how he had guarded himself against any disaster that human thought could foresee. But out of the very completeness came a fear. In such an enterprise as ours, the bounds of human thought were but narrow. Beyond it lay the vast of divine wisdom and divine power. When we came back to the cave, Mr. Trelawney took up another theme. "We have now to settle definitely the exact hour at which the great experiment is to be made. So far as science and mechanism go, if the preparations are complete, all hours are the same. But as we have had to deal with preparations made by a woman of extraordinarily subtle mind, and who had full belief in magic and had a cryptic meaning in everything, we should place ourselves in her position before deciding. It is now manifest that the sunset has an important place in the arrangements. As those suns, cut so mathematically by the edge of the sarcophagus, were arranged of full design, we must take our cue from this. Again, we find all along that the number 7 has had an important bearing on every phase of the Queen's thought and reasoning and action. The logical result is that the 7th hour after sunset was the time fixed on. This is borne out by the fact that on each of the occasions when action was taken in my house, this was the time chosen. As the sun sets tonight in Cornwall at 8, our hour is to be 3 in the morning. He spoke in a matter-of-fact way, though with great gravity, but there was nothing of mystery in his word or manner. Still, we were all impressed to a remarkable degree. I could see this in the other men by the pallor that came on some of their faces, and by the stillness and unquestioning silence with which the decision was received. The only one who remained in any way at ease was Margaret, who had lapsed into one of her moods of abstraction, but who seemed to wake up to a note of gladness. Her father, who was watching her intently, smiled. Her mood was to him a direct confirmation of his theory. For myself, I was almost overcome. The definite fixing of the hour seemed like the voice of doom. When I think of it now, I can realize how a condemned man feels at his sentence, or at the sounding of the last hour he is to hear. There could be no going back now. We were in the hands of God. The hands of God. And yet, what other forces were arrayed? What would become of us all, poor atoms of earthly dust whirled in the wind which cometh whence and goeth whither no man may know? It was not for myself. Margaret! I was recalled by Mr. Trelawney's firm voice. Now we shall see to the lamps and finish our preparations. Accordingly we set to work, and under his supervision made ready the Egyptian lamps, seeing that they were well filled with the cedar oil, and that the wicks were adjusted and in good order. We lighted and tested them one by one, and left them ready so that they would light at once and evenly. When this was done, we had a general look around, and fixed all in readiness for our work at night. All this had taken time, and we were, I think, all surprised when, as we emerged from the cave, we heard the great clock in the hall chime 4. We had a late lunch, a thing possible without trouble in the present state of our commissariat arrangements. After it, by Mr. Trelawney's advice, we separated, each to prepare in our own way for the strain of the coming night. Margaret looked pale and somewhat overwrought, so I advised her to lie down and try to sleep. She promised that she would. The abstraction which had been upon her fitfully all day lifted for the time. With all her old sweetness and loving delicacy, she kissed me good-bye for the present. With the sense of happiness which this gave me, I went out for a walk on the cliffs. I did not want to think, and I had an instinctive feeling that fresh air and God's sunlight, and the myriad beauties of the works of His hand, would be the best preparation of fortitude for what was to come. When I got back, all the party were assembling for a late tea. Coming fresh from the exhilaration of nature, it struck me as almost comic that we, who were nearing the end of so strange, almost monstrous, an undertaking, should be yet bound by the needs and habits of our lives. All the men of the party were grave. The time of seclusion, even if it had given them rest, had also given opportunity for thought. Margaret was bright, almost buoyant, but I missed about her something of her usual spontaneity. Towards myself there was a shadowy air of reserve, which brought back something of my suspicion. When tea was over, she went out of the room, but returned in a minute with the roll of drawing which she had taken with her earlier in the day. Coming close to Mr. Trelawney, she said, "Father, I have been carefully considering what you said today about the hidden meaning of those suns and hearts and kas, and I have been examining the drawings again." "And with what result, my child?" asked Mr. Trelawney eagerly. "There is another reading possible." "And that?" His voice was now tremulous with anxiety. Margaret spoke with a strange ring in her voice, a ring that cannot be, unless there is the consciousness of truth behind it. "It means that at the sunset the Ka is to enter the Ab, and it is only at the sunrise that it will leave it." "Go on," said her father hoarsely. "It means that for this night the Queen's double, which is otherwise free, will remain in her heart, which is mortal and cannot leave its prison place in the mummy shrouding. It means that when the sun has dropped into the sea, Queen Tera will cease to exist as a conscious power till sunrise, unless the great experiment can recall her to waking life. It means that there will be nothing whatever for you or others to fear from her in such way as we have all cause to remember. Whatever change may come from the working of the great experiment, there can come none from the poor, helpless, dead woman who has waited all those centuries for this night, who has given up to the coming hour all the freedom of eternity, won in the old way, in hope of a new life, in a new world such as she longed for." She stopped suddenly. As she had gone on speaking, there had come with her words a strange, pathetic, almost pleading tone which touched me to the quick. As she stopped, I could see, before she turned away her head, that her eyes were full of tears. For once the heart of her father did not respond to her feeling. He looked exultant, but with a grim masterfulness which reminded me of the set look of his stern face as he had lain in the trance. He did not offer any consolation to his daughter in her sympathetic pain. He only said, "We may test the accuracy of your surmise, and of her feeling, when the time comes." Having said so, he went up the stone stairway and into his own room. Margaret's face had a troubled look as she gazed after him. Strangely enough, her trouble did not as usual touch me to the quick. When Mr. Trelawney had gone, silence reigned. I do not think that any of us wanted to talk. Presently Margaret went to her room, and I went out on the terrace over the sea. The fresh air and the beauty of all before helped to restore the good spirits which I had known earlier in the day. Presently I felt myself actually rejoicing in the belief that the danger which I had feared from the Queen's violence on the coming night was obviated. I believed in Margaret's belief so thoroughly that it did not occur to me to dispute her reasoning. In a lofty frame of mind, and with less anxiety than I had felt for days, I went to my room and lay down on the sofa. I was awaked by Corbett calling to me hurriedly, "Come down to the cave as quickly as you can. Mr. Trelawney wants to see us all there at once. Hurry!" I jumped up and ran down to the cave. All were there except Margaret, who came immediately after me carrying Silvio in her arms. When the cat saw his old enemy he struggled to get down, but Margaret held him fast and soothed him. I looked at my watch. It was close to 8. When Margaret was with us, her father said directly, with a quiet insistence which was new to me, "You believe, Margaret, that Queen Tera has voluntarily undertaken to give up her freedom for this night? To become a mummy and nothing more, till the experiment has been completed? To be content that she shall be powerless under all and any circumstances until after all is over, and the act of resurrection has been accomplished, or the effort has failed?" After a pause, Margaret answered in a low voice, Yes. In the pause, her whole being, appearance, expression, voice, manner had changed. Even Silvio noticed it, and with a violent effort, wriggled away from her arms. She did not seem to notice the act. I expected that the cat, when he had achieved his freedom, would have attacked the mummy, but on this occasion he did not. He seemed too cowed to approach it. He shrunk away, and with a piteous meow, came over and rubbed himself against my ankles. I took him up in my arms, and he nestled there content. Mr. Trelawney spoke again. "You are sure of what you say? You believe it with all your soul?" Margaret's face had lost the abstracted look. It now seemed illuminated with the devotion of one to whom is given to speak of great things. She answered in a voice which, though quiet, vibrated with conviction. "I know it. My knowledge is beyond belief." Mr. Trelawney spoke again. "Then you are so sure that were you Queen Tera herself, you would be willing to prove it in any way that I might suggest?" "Yes, any way." The answer rang out fearlessly. He spoke again, in a voice in which was no note of doubt. "Even in the abandonment of your familiar to death, to annihilation?" She paused, and I could see that she suffered horribly. There was in her eyes a hunted look, which no man can, unmoved, see in the eyes of his beloved. I was about to interrupt, when her father's eyes, glancing round with a fierce determination, met mine. I stood silent, almost spellbound. So also the other men. Something was going on before us which we did not understand. With a few long strides, Mr. Trelawney went to the west side of the cave and tore back the shutter which obscured the window. The cool air blew in, and the sunlight streamed over them both, for Margaret was now by his side. He pointed to where the sun was sinking into the sea in a halo of golden fire, and his face was as set as flint. In a voice whose absolute uncompromising hardness I shall hear in my ears at times till my dying day, he said, "Choose! Speak! When the sun has dipped below the sea, it will be too late." The glory of the dying sun seemed to light up Margaret's face, till it shone as if lit from within by a noble light, as she answered, "Even that!" Then, stepping over to where the mummy cat stood on the little table, she placed her hand on it. She had now left the sunlight, and the shadows looked dark and deep over her. In a clear voice she said, "Were I Tera, I would say, 'Take all I have. This night is for the gods alone.'" As she spoke, the sun dipped, and the cold shadow suddenly fell on us. We all stood still for a while. Silvio jumped from my arms and ran over to his mistress, rearing himself up against her dress as if asking to be lifted. He took no notice whatever of the mummy now. Margaret was glorious with all her wonted sweetness, as she said sadly, "The sun is down, Father. Shall any of us see it again? The night of nights is come." End of chapter 18. Recording by Roger Moline.